Okay, so today we are going to finish our discussion about A Rose for Emily. And last time we spoke, we finished up with talking about similes. We had mentioned the themes, which you're going to need to decide which one you want to focus on for your thesis, in determining which one is most important and why. And then we talked about the setting as well as the plot and some of the symbols. So today I want to continue our discussion and we will start off talking about irony. I again have my guest speaker with us. And so basically, I'm just going to start off the discussion with asking you what are some of the most important instances of irony that you find? And let's take them one at a time and we'll kind of discuss why that is considered irony. Remember, guys, that in our handout, the Writing About Literature handout, irony is described as a contrast between what is expected and what actually occurs.
Well, one of the most obvious um, forms of irony or examples of irony is Emily's last name and how respected of a name she has and what people expect from someone with that name and what she actually does in the story.
Okay, so there's a huge contrast between what people expected from her status and her family status in the town and what actually happens to that family's name by the end of the story. So obviously, um, there's also some other things that are brought up. They talk about an aunt who had some mental illness problems. And we're also given the hint that maybe she also shares in that mental illness. She certainly commits murder, and some of the things that she does afterwards, we can assume there's some kind of mental illness involved. So there is a huge contrast between what the town expects and what actually happens in the way that her status symbol um, kind of allows her to get away with everything, including murder. Okay, what's another example of irony that you think is important?
The idea that she fell in love with or infatuation with Homer, um, because once again, the way she was raised and the fact that her dad didn't think anybody was good enough for her, and then here she is falling for a worker, a
Laborer, yeah.
laborer, a northerner,
Hmm.
all these things that no one would expect her to go for.
And also the fact that we're told he's gay, right?
Right.
So this is also adds to the contrast between what is expected and what actually happens. So her expectations of Homer was that he would fall in love with her. Even the town's expectations was that he would fall in love with her, marry her, and they would end up happily ever after. But he turns out to enjoy the company of men rather than women. So that's the first set of irony in that relationship. Also, again, you mentioned the fact that he is not wealthy, doesn't have a uh, you know name that carries status like hers. He's a laborer. He's literally only in town to work on the sidewalks, and he also is from the north. And this is a proud Southern family. So yes, I would say that whole relationship is it's very ironic for the reader to and the town to recognize that she had some type of relationship with him. Okay. Any other irony you want to mention?
Oh, there's lots of irony in the story. Something I think is funny, a funny example of irony is when they, after Miss Emily dies, and they are going through her house and they want to bust in this room, but they want to wait until, she's good and buried before they
Absolutely.
go busting her house down. So,
So they wanted to give her respect and wait until she's in the ground and buried, but they just can't wait. They're all biting at the bit
and the
to
fact there's a big crowd
right
there just to bust
to
this door
exploit
open.
her secrets. And they all knew there was a secret there, but they thought the respectful thing to do was to wait till she was buried and then all stand around and gawk at her
Mm-hmm.
secrecy. So yes, that's also. And speaking of that, there's some irony in the fact of the decor of that room, right? Because we have to keep in mind the room is a tomb itself.
Right.
It's a murder scene. Also, probably some necrophilia happened. We can assume there's something going on wrong in there either way, but it's delicately and very purposefully, meticulously kept. So we see the crystals, we see the rose-colored curtains and light, and we see the silver brush set with the neatly folded clothes. So it's a very weird scene. It's our irony that we see this room kept so nice for such a terrible thing. Any other instances of irony? I would like to mention the fact that the town's women took it among themselves to kind of nose their way into Miss Emily's affairs. Whenever she started seeing Homer, they thought that's, beneath her. And they even began to say, this is such a bad look for the town. It's shameful for the young people to see her act that way. It's a bad example. And they asked the preacher to go over and talk to her, and that didn't work at all. And he wouldn't even talk about what they talked about because it was so terrible for him. And then the next Sunday they see her out again with Homer, riding around in the yellow buggy. So they decide to take it upon themselves, specifically the preacher's wife, to call her cousins to come in and kind of save the day. They're expecting the cousins to come in and change everything. And what's ironic about it is the cousins didn't change anything about any of the situation. They only made it worse for the townspeople. The townspeople said they're even more Grierson than Emily is, meaning they're even more stuck up. And they become actual, it says in the text, allies of Emily to get, they're trying to get the cousins out with her. So I think it's irony that she kind of ends up winning the townspeople over on her side just because her cousins are so awful, and they're the ones who invited the cousins over. Let me see. Anything else concerning irony? Did you have anything else in your notes? Okay. So those are a few examples of irony that we can see happening in A Rose for Emily. I'm certain there's a lot more that we're just not thinking about right now. You'll be able to look through those and find them on your own. But irony is going to be an important aspect in terms of trying to discuss what the author actually meant with your theme and why that was important. So let's move on to similes and metaphors, okay? So what are a few similes or metaphors that you found to be interesting in the text?
On page 119,
Mm-hmm.
there's a pretty good metaphor there.
Are you talking about where it's talking about her house
Yes.
being an eyesore among eyesores?
Yes.
Okay. So this metaphor is talking about the house that she's in, how it used to be on a nice street, but it's comparing it to being an eyesore among eyesores. So it's obviously in a decayed position, and that's why it's called an eyesore, being among other eyesores, comparing it to the worst of the worst, right?
Right.
Okay. Any other similes or metaphors you want to talk about?
There's a simile on page 121.
Let me get over there. Oh, are you talking about when they're referring to her body?
Motionless, yet like and big.
Mm-hmm. You want to read that out loud? That sentence? She looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water, and of that pallid hue.
Mm-hmm.
Her eyes, lost in the fatty ridges of her face, looked like two small,
small pieces of coal. That's another simile there.
pressed into a lump of dough. So here we're using the similes to reference her appearance, which, just thought of it, this is another piece of irony, her appearance versus her attitude and her presence. Her appearance was very, as I just read, she was not a large woman in stature. She was kind of plump, small, demure even, diminutive in her size. But her presence, I think we can all agree, carried a huge, monstrous presence. You know, people dreaded having to be alone in the room with her. So that's irony. But yes, here the simile is like a body long submerged in motionless water. So what do you think of when you hear that? Like a body submerged long in motionless water. What would a body like that look? But it would be very yucky looking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's besides just the bloated, it's the color. They also said, and of that pallid hue. So that grayish,
Right.
unhealthy, moist look. So, any other similes and metaphors that we can point out?
I mean, there are so many. There's some on page 123. The top of page 126 is a good one.
All right, let me look on 123, see what I see there.
Sorry, my paper isn't just divided the same as.
Okay. Well, can you just read it out loud for me? On 123?
The top of page 126 probably easy.
Well, I see the simile. Were you talking about simile or a metaphor? I see a simile on 123 where it says, we had long thought of them as a tableau, where the town is talking about the family, and we talked about the symbolism of the tableau.
Symbolism.
But there's also a simile there because they're referring to the family, the Griersons, Emily and her father, as a tableau. What do you think of if you only thought of a family as a tableau, as a painting of some sort?
Perfect.
Okay.
Or at least Stuck in Time.
Yes, I think definitely Stuck in Time is a good one. And you said 126 also.
Top of page 126.
Let me find 126. Oh yeah. She looked back at him, erect, her face like a strained flag. So, I mean, that, I think, when I think of Miss Emily's face, I imagine it like a strained flag. Very straight, rigid, not moving. So as you can see, I mean, we've mostly mentioned similes, but there's lots of similes, lots of metaphors throughout this entire work. And you're going to try to find the similes and the metaphors and talk about what those similes and metaphors mean in understanding the bigger picture of what's going on in the work. So let's recap. So far, we've talked about the similes and metaphors. We've talked about irony. We've talked about symbols. We've talked about plot and theme. We've talked about themes. Well, yeah, themes with the plot. We've talked about setting. And now we need to talk about characters. So we need to do a little bit of character analysis. And what that means is we're going to break down those characters and talk about what they mean in understanding the overall story. So let's dive right in. So when you're doing a character analysis of Emily's father, And even though he is a minor character, because he doesn't even have any live speaking roles in this story, he still is kind of a dominant figure, wouldn't you say?
Yes, he's definitely not only an imposing figure in the story, but he's an imposing figure in Emily's life, um, and that's most easily depicted in how the townspeople see them and the tableau we mentioned.
It's also how Emily sees them, isn't it? Emily kind of has always cast her own self in his shadow.
Yeah, she seeks his approval. That's why his makeshift portrait is always watching Emily.
Right. She's got him right there in the sitting room, in front of the fireplace, front and center, that crayon drawing. And so we do see this character who is kind of like larger than life. And we can see that in that painting that we talked about, that the townspeople always imagine of them. He's holding that horse whip, he's in front. So he's this character who kind of dominates her life. And because of his domination over her throughout her life, we see her constantly making these decisions. We can tell that she was told and taught from a very early age that she was better and too good for people, specifically men. He ran off all the men in her life, which probably implied to her that none of them were ever going to be good enough. And so when she is rejected by the one man that she tries to find comfort in, Homer, and not only that, but she's rejected by a northerner who is a day laborer and doesn't have money or status and is also gay. That rejection, mixed with her need to seek for her father's approval, was just too much for her to be able to mentally comprehend. Right?
Right.
So I think that his imposing figure is very important in understanding the story. Another minor character I want to talk about is Toby, the house servant, who stays completely loyal to her. What would you have to say about Toby?
Toby is one of the easier characters to examine just because most of his actions are fueled by a mix of loyalty and fear. Because of Toby's age and because of the time period the story is set in, it's pretty safe to assume that Toby was probably born on a plantation. He was born a slave. He grew up with certain rules. And more importantly, he grew up in the house with Miss Emily his entire life, probably.
And people forget that even though slavery ended in 1865, technically, in the minds of not only white people but also black people, slavery persisted for years and years after that.
Correct.
It wasn't just like a veil lifted and all of a sudden everyone acted right. So Toby, more than likely, I can assume that he did not have any family. Do you get the impression he had no family or friends, close friends? So he relied solely on his benefactors, which would have been the Griersons. And I assume that he was probably born a slave into their family, and kept as a token of those times that are forgotten, right? He doesn't seem to be mistreated, but I can't imagine that he's treated too awfully well.
Right.
But there's no direct indication that he's completely mistreated in terms of like beaten or starved or anything like that. But we know that he is manipulated at the very least into doing a lot of her dirty work, right? Because we know this with the Homer situation. And we know that he is at least knowledgeable that it's wrong, because as soon as the first people show up after her death, he greets them at the door and then he walks immediately out the back door, never to be seen again. Because he's knowledgeable enough to realize
I don't need to be here.
Yes.
After they find out.
Yes. And what can we assume would have happened if he'd stayed?
Oh, he would have been punished for it.
He
For
would have won
sure.
he would have been the one who took the fall because one, he's black, and two, she's a Grierson, right? They would have wanted to blame it on anyone else besides her. Um, even with the long gray strand of hair that was found on the pillow. Um, so Toby, I think, even though he seems like a very simple, flat character, there's some depth to Toby in terms of what he's representative of in her life. Would any of this have been possible for her without Toby? Would her lifestyle choices have been possible without Toby?
No, Toby completely took care of her, especially once she shut herself in the house. She wouldn't have been able to do that if she didn't have someone to go out into the public sphere for her.
Exactly. And I think it's significant that the only real relationship, long-term relationship she had with anyone in her life was Toby. We can assume she shared a house with this man. He probably lived on the corner somewhere, right? To be there at her every beck and call. And so
He lived there.
yeah, he if not there, right off in a shed or somewhere off the house, but he was there for her at every second of every day, and he did everything for her, really honestly debilitating her, but I mean, he had no choice in that because he was the servant. But he was the only real long-term relationship she had, and for us to understand the type of person she was even better, we have to understand the type of person he was, because that's her real long-term relationship. And what does it say about him in terms of speaking? Remember, it says
He never talks.
he never talked.
talked.
He used his voice so rarely that in his
sounded
older
like
age, it became
hoarse,
rusty and
right.
hoarse and coarse. So, I mean, that should tell you enough about being in a relationship with Miss Emily, right? She doesn't want to hear what you have to say. She's not interested in your thoughts or your
Right.
ideas.
Right.
Okay, so a few other minor characters, the cousins. I mean, I think they're pretty flat characters. We can tell that they're bougie, stuck up, really only doing their familial duty, but they don't feel any kind of kindred spirit with her. They don't feel super connected or close with her. Her father had cast out that side of the family. Remember, it says because they had argued about the aunt in her estate once she died. So I feel that those characters are really only there kind of as supporting evidence of her and her father's name and where it came from.
Yeah, just a further example of
Their status.
Their status, but what people think when they think of her name, which further pushes the irony of what actually happens in the story.
Right. But they are good enough to come back and have the funeral, and they stick around to see what the secret was, right? So then we have the main characters, as we would call it. Homer. Well, no, there is one other character I want to mention. The pharmacist. What did you think about the pharmacist? I mean, he's mentioned very briefly, but I think it's significant in how he interacts with Emily.
I think the pharmacist is kind of symbolic and representative of the town as a whole.
Yeah.
And their attitude toward her. He tries multiple times to get the full answer out of her.
And it's not really even out of curiosity. It's more like, are you sure you want to do this?
Right. And whenever he sees that she's clearly not cooperating, he just kind of folds and gives in. And that's kind of the same thing everybody in the town has always
Right.
done with her.
I mean, that's the first introduction we have to her, is that whole tax scene where she's like, no, I don't owe any taxes. Check
Right.
your records. But yeah, I agree. The pharmacist, it's almost endearing the way that he really wants to keep her out of trouble, but he's not going. And it's almost like everybody's just too afraid to be impolite, you know? they're stuck on this ancient idea of nobility and how you interact with nobility, and doing something that's faux pas, or taboo. You would never accuse a lady of smelling to her face, would you? Remember that line?
Right.
Same thing. He would never accuse a lady of trying to murder someone, and she literally dares